For burnout in general and psychedelics specifically, please do not try to hack this on your own. If you're listening to this, these are not circumstances that are meant to be dealt with alone in a container, isolated. Part of the issue, I think, with burnout in general is that it is a very isolating experience.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics Podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about plant medicine and psychedelics, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is a very special guest and one of my new best friends, Eliza Collins, otherwise known as the Burnout Witch. Eliza, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Scott, thank you so much for having me on Webdelics. I'm so excited to be here. So yes, as you said, I'm the Burnout Witch, and I got into burnout recovery as a result of burning out myself. So a little bit of my background in a quick summary is I was a child of big T trauma. So my biological mother passed away when I was 13 months old. And that kind of set me up for a variety of things like imposter syndrome, perfectionism, not enoughness, very, very common with childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And those things were very useful for me when I was younger because I was a straight A student and I was very dedicated and very committed to things. And as I got older, that became more problematic for me because obviously life is not perfect and things are not perfect. And everybody has a little bit of imposter syndrome and fits in different places. And so as I got older, I got a degree in chemistry. I got a degree in acupuncture and Eastern medicine after being pre-med. And I started my own business. And I moved to a city where I didn't know anybody to start a business, which I didn't know most people don't do that. This is, can I curse on here, by the way?
Yes.
Okay. So for much of my life, it's been accidentally fuck around and find out. And I just found out after the fact. And now I kind of do that intentionally. It's a very fun way to sort of like magical mystery tour, choose your own adventure way to live. But I decided to move to where I currently am in Providence, Rhode Island, and start a business because I thought that that's what people did. And I was doing everything. So I was wearing all of the hats. I was the acupuncturist, but I was also the receptionist and the biller and the marketing specialist. And I'm an introvert. Like I don't like, networking and marketing and all of that stuff. It was really hard for me. And in the process of doing that, I also felt like I didn't have enough information. Chinese medicine that I practice is over 5,000 years old, and I had been doing it for like a year.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of continuing education. I really put a lot of responsibility on myself and piled stuff onto myself to try and be successful the way I was told you need to be successful as an acupuncturist. And after about 5 years, I burned out horribly doing that. And I contacted a friend and a colleague whom you know, Kate Donovan,
Yeah.
who ran very successful acupuncture practices in Europe. And she had moved someplace where she didn't know anybody and done that. So I reached out to her and I said, "Hey, I'm struggling with my business right now, and you knocked it out of the park a couple of times. How did you do this?" And she goes, "Oh, I burned out doing that, and you were burnt out, and I'm going to help you with that. And once we start to process that, your business will be better, and your life will feel better." And so that was absolutely true. And I had spent, a couple of decades in therapy working on my trauma history from my childhood, from the death of my mom and these various other things. And I had done burnout recovery and felt really good about that. And ended up kind of getting into that space with some of my other skills. So bringing Chinese medicine, functional medicine, hypnosis, mindset work, all of that to the work that I was doing. And all of that was really useful. And I was still struggling sometimes with my emotional regulation. And it felt like the tools that I had were helpful to a point, but I couldn't really connect with my body. And it didn't matter if I did yoga nidra, and it didn't matter if I did breathing techniques. They were only helpful to a point. And I have been a contract provider with the VA, the Veterans Affairs Association, for a decade. And I had known some of my clients who had come to me from there asking about psychedelics and wanting it for PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And so I watched their journey through it, and they had asked me what I knew about it, which I didn't really know anything at the time because I wasn't much of a partier in high school. I was a band geek, so I didn't do psychedelics. But I was a scientist, and I understood the biochemistry of it. So I got kind of digging into that and looking into it more for my clients. And at a certain point, I was like, okay, a lot of what I'm struggling with and a lot of what I'm dealing with is pre-verbal trauma. My
Mm-hmm.
mom died when I was 1. So I didn't have words for it then, and I don't have a way to integrate that now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to utilize psychedelics for myself. It was beyond transformative. It was unlike anything I've ever experienced. And for the first time in my life, after the first time I utilized them, I felt fully embodied. I could feel and experience emotions and thoughts in a fully embodied way where I
Mm.
didn't feel overwhelmed by them, and I could process them and I could appreciate them. And it was really extraordinary. Um, but like I said, I'm not much of a partier. And so I didn't necessarily want that big dose trip multiple times. So I started exploring microdosing. And that's really where I found my niche, both personally and as a provider. Um, so yeah, that brings us to today.
There is a lot in what you just said that I'm going to want to extract as we move forward in the conversation, particularly the things that you shared with regards to some of your early trauma, as well as the relationship of that trauma to burnout, and then how that all ties together with psychedelics. But before we get into all of that, I have to ask you a question that I've just been dying to ask ever since I met you.
Yeah.
Do burnout witches ever cackle?
I don't normally I don't have a good cackle.
Oh.
I don't know if you can tell, but I don't have a scary voice. Um, I have been sick, and so I actually probably could pull it off right now. But as a fun side fact about me, I used to perform at haunted houses,
Ah.
and part of the thing that was quote unquote scary about me was that I didn't speak ever. I would just stone faced and often just like sit there looking like a wax figure until I just like twitched and freaked people out. So
That
yeah, no,
that is
I think we
terrifying. That's
could
like
cackle.
that's very Doctor Who. I'm sort of scared even thinking about it. Maybe we're gonna have to come up with a new nickname for you, the Silent Burnout Witch. But
Ooh,
I love it. Well, that's because I came up with it. But in any event, that sort of leads us to the topic of the day, which is how psychedelics can help you deal with burnout. Now, before we get into some of the details of your program and your journey and how and why psychedelics help with this issue, I want to make sure that we have an understanding as to some of the basic terms that we're using. Well, one basic term in particular, and that is burnout. I hear that word all the time, and it's one of those things like closure or
yeah.
discovery. Like, what does that mean? So, if you could explain exactly what burnout is, it would be really helpful for me because sometimes I don't know whether I have it or not.
It's such a great question, and it's something that I was on a an office hours call today with a burnout group, and somebody said like I feel like it's watered down, like the word is watered down
Yeah.
because you hear it all over the place. It is, something like closure. So the best definition, working definition that I have of burnout is it's a state of sustained chronic stress that over time decreases your ability to handle day-to-day stress with ease.
Mm.
And burnout was sort of first quote unquote identified by Christina Maslach, and she had the Maslach Burnout Inventory, and that was looking at healthcare providers. And so that was looking at things like a decreased sense of satisfaction at work, a sense of disconnect with the patients that people were treating. So those were the types of things that they were looking for. But we know, particularly now post pandemic, that burnout happens all over the place. It can happen to people like me as an entrepreneur. It can happen to stay at home parents, because I don't know if you know, but that's a job and it like doesn't turn off at the end of the day. So it is a state of sustained chronic stress that over time makes it harder to deal with your day-to-day stressors, largely speaking.
And how do I know if I'm just having a bad day or a series of bad days or am officially burned out?
One of the things that our friend Kate likes to talk about is resentment. And so, if you're finding yourself very resentful of having to do your job, having to take care of your pets or your family or show up in places, resentment is a really, really big thing. If you are finding that you are more fatigued, that you're waking up tired, sometimes one of the things that I see that I often treat from a functional medicine perspective with clients is you start developing food sensitivities that you didn't have before.
Oh.
If you work out and you find that you are injuring yourself more easily or you're not recovering as well, things that brought you joy aren't bringing you joy anymore, or it's very difficult to access those things. Those are indications that you can be headed towards or in burnout. And oftentimes when people are like, I think I might be burnt out, you're probably already burnt out. It's not something that we often necessarily see coming until we're already there.
Eliza, that's a great point. And I need to sit on it and think a lot of folks probably will need to sit on it. Have I ever said to myself or asked myself, am I burned out or not? Like you said, maybe that's a hint that you are. Thank you. And it goes as to the uh, potential widespread number of people that can be impacted by it. I'm glad that you raised parents, because people might not think of that as a group that would be burned out. Like you said, is burnout I associate with a job, usually a caring
Hmm.
profession job, not
Hmm.
being a parent, but it is a job and it does involve care. And if you care about what you're working on in any event, I would imagine that that could put you at risk of burnout, particularly if you have trauma. Talk to us a little bit about the relationship between trauma and a propensity to become a victim of burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I like to distinguish between when we talk about trauma is big T trauma and little t trauma. So, when we hear the word trauma, we think about things like PTSD. So, we think about veterans coming back from war.
Yeah.
We think about these really large scale type abuses of physical abuse, which I don't mean to diminish in any way, shape, or form. We think about something like my case where a parent died when I was a baby. We don't often think about the micro trauma that happens, sometimes whether people intend it to or not.
Mm.
So, having a parent who isn't present, who loves you very much, but a single parent who has to work two jobs and they're not home. And when they are home, they're supportive and they love you, but you need to find this sense of independence in order to be able to function. And so you feel like you can't ask the world for help. That's a type of trauma. Going to school every day, you know, first day at school in kindergarten, you get bullied and you get bullied by the same person
Mm.
every single day. That's a small trauma, quote
Mhm.
unquote, but over time that builds up and they can code into your system in the same way. And our body remembers our trauma. So there's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And it talks about the way that we store trauma in our bodies. And so it's not just something that happened to us once or happened to us over a period of time, and then it's over and we're okay. It's something that informs how we show up in the world, and it shapes the way that we show up in the world. And so even when we're no longer exposed to that type of traumatic experience, we're already pre-programmed to function in a way that tries to protect us. And so things like perfectionism and imposter syndrome, like I mentioned, those are things that were helpful for me for a period of time as a child and that can be helpful for other people. Believing that you can't rely on somebody else, so you have to do everything yourself because you couldn't when you were a child, it makes it harder to ask for help as an adult. And so our bodies and our brains remember this trauma, and they set up these coping mechanisms that might be very helpful when we're younger, but start to break down when we're older, because we do function in community and we
Yeah.
do need help and we are not islands. And it makes it really challenging. And the other thing that I like to talk about when it comes to trauma and burnout is your attachment style. So when we have a good relationship with our families, we get the support that we need. We're allowed to be rebellious little toddlers, but we're allowed to do that in a really supportive container. That creates what we call secure attachment. Most people have something that is not secure attachment. So that can be anxious, where you have very clingy. It can be avoidant, where you're like, nope, I don't want anything to do with that. Or it can be anxious avoidant, which is a combo platter of the two, which often results in like a freeze response. So this trauma sets us up to kind of code our fight flight responses and the way that we interact with the world around us, whether we're anxious or avoidant or a combination or secure if we're very lucky. And so all of that creates this pattern that as an adult goes out into the world and now has to function by a different set of rules as an adult, because we don't have the
Right.
container of childhood. And so we're trying to execute our lives and our relationships based on coping mechanisms that aren't necessarily useful for us as adults and tend to have us getting in our own way.
I have committed to the audience of this show, and hopefully, in the eyes of the audience, have followed through on that commitment to always be honest and to keep it real. And that includes about myself. One of the things that I've shared with folks throughout this show is that I suffered from severe trauma as a child. And as you have just discussed, it impacted how I viewed the world and then how I interacted with the world. Being blunt, it limited the response mechanisms that I had to difficult circumstances. I grew up with PTSD, was severely traumatized, and as we've discussed and had a number of guests share, psychedelics have a profound effect on one's ability to heal from trauma. You're linking then trauma to burnout. I'm hearing in a way that burnout, while it may be caused by whatever professional or work or other circumstances that you're in, it's almost a symptom of the underlying issue, not necessarily the core issue itself, which explains to me why psilocybin may be useful in dealing with it. But talk to me a little bit more about whether my assumptions are correct or not.
Yeah, we talk about like what is the cause of burnout, and the farther I've gotten into every element of what I do as a practitioner, because we used to talk about the root cause of, somebody's issue when we're in Chinese medicine. What's the root cause of their digestive issues or whatever? It's more an intersection of all of the things that contribute to it. So someone's job and their trauma may intersect in such a way that it results in burnout. So, yes, can your job cause burnout? Yes. But is it causing burnout because you also have a pattern that feeds into that? So it's not, we talk about burnout being a systemic issue, and it is. But I think it's also part of the reason it's a systemic issue is because the systemic way in which we fail to address mental health and trauma is a factor in that. And so it's really kind of a constellation of issues that when they match up the right way, it can lead to burnout.
Well, and I have to say, for many years, I didn't deal with the underlying traumas that were causing me to respond to difficult situations in a certain way. I would just respond to the work situation that I was in, usually by quitting. And then I would get burned out all over again.
Yeah.
And because I wasn't, as I'm hearing you say, really looking at the whole picture, both from a global perspective, but also from the perspective of how things work together, I wasn't able to ever really break that pattern itself, which looking back on it was a ridiculous pattern to continue to be in after a while. I think I'd get a clue. I can be hard-headed sometimes. How does using psilocybin within your coaching practice work? How does it look for a client?
So there are, as I'm sure you've probably talked about on the podcast multiple times, Scott, there are multiple ways that you can use psychedelics. There are a variety of different psychedelics that people can utilize. So I specifically work with psilocybin with individuals, and I actually chose to help them do what I call consciously microdose.
Mm.
So, a lot of the research that we have in psychedelics right now is on these large doses.
Mm-hmm.
So, people taking a large dose to address something like PTSD or treatment resistant anxiety and depression. There's very good research and support for treating things like addiction. Most recently, I saw an article about treating anorexia nervosa with psychedelics. So, it's really fantastic, but a lot of that research is based on large dose trips. And a lot of the people that were coming to me don't want to have that experience,
Mm-hmm.
but they still want to be able to experience the benefits of a psychedelic. So I started looking at the intricacies of what microdosing actually is. And one of the beautiful things that I think is so fantastic about psychedelics and the way that I describe them to people is it's not something that you take to feel better. It's something that you take that is a key that opens a door, and it's your ability to walk through that door and do that work in a state of expanded neuroplasticity. That's where the healing comes from, and that's where the change comes from. So, generally, what I do with my clients is I help them figure out what an appropriate microdosing schedule is, what the amount is, how frequently they want to take it, what that looks like. And then during that time, have supported conversations about what is it that they want to address, because psychedelics have this really amazing way of kind of worming into our brain and going into the places that we haven't looked or
Mm-hmm.
that we struggle with. And so being able to have support during that experience is really critical. And being able to do that with a microdose where you don't have to have that feeling of a lack of control or not being able to be present because of fear or shame is a real gift. I've found it gives people the opportunity to engage with it in a way that gives them a bit more agency over the experience, because part of the beautiful thing of a large trip is really letting go and leaning into it. But if you're burnt out, you don't necessarily have the emotional resources to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
During burnout, one of the things that happens is your prefrontal cortex, so the part of your brain that is responsible for decision making, inhibitory behaviors, memory, like emotional regulation, all of that tends to become more difficult because that prefrontal cortex shrinks. So,
Mm.
one of the things that we do is we try and give you tools to help grow that back a little bit and then utilize psychedelics in a smaller, safer way so that we're not like tipping you over the edge and being like, here's $20, make good choices. Because that's the last thing that you want to do for somebody in burnout.
I've got to say, that image of burnout causing the brain to shrink, I don't know, that really lands with me in a way that is almost as scary as the silent burnout witch might be, where I'm not talking
Dude,
to her
it's
right
super
now.
terrifying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it makes me think of other issues like alcoholism or physical things that cause this sort of damage to the brain. And so if
Mhm.
it comes then to linking that particular outcome associated with burnout and something that really can enhance the ability of the brain to process, um, that's a pretty compelling case. But but if I were listening to this or watching this on YouTube, I might be asking myself, okay, Scott, you've had guests on here that are saying psychedelics can do everything from resolve PTSD to deal with addiction and help you become more creative. And is there anything it can't do? I'm starting to feel like this is shark fins, which can do everything from heal your cartilage to prevent cancer. What would you say to someone who is thinking that exact thought? And yes, we both know there's someone who's thinking it. If you're in that person in the audience, well, you can be honest with yourself. We still love you.
And thanks for asking that question. These are the types of questions that we need. Um, it's hard to say because, again, this is such a new area of research for us from a kind of medical and health perspective. I always remind myself that this is not new medicine. Indigenous cultures have been using this for centuries, millennia. There's a very good, long, meaningful history and tradition of the way that these things are used. And so this is not new information. It's just new to us in a new way because we're looking at it through a new lens.
Right.
We're not looking at it through an indigenous lens. So is there anything that it can't do? Probably. I don't really subscribe to there's, one ring to rule them all when it comes to any kind of treatment modality. And I actually don't adhere to that from a point of view of psychedelics either, because if I hadn't done the healing work that I had done, if I hadn't learned the somatic techniques and the hypnotic techniques and the self-support techniques and the self-care techniques that I had, my psychedelic experience would have been very, very different and probably spectacularly unpleasant because I would not have been able to show up for myself. So there is no replacement for the amount of preparation that I needed to be able to utilize a psychedelic. And a psychedelic wouldn't have given me those things. So are there things that it can't do? Probably. It depends on what lens you're looking through.
2 important points. First of all, you are the second guest on this show to bring in a Lord of the Rings reference. Bram Rector, that's the other Lord of the Rings reference that came up in this show. So if you're a Lord of the Rings fan and you're listening to or watching the show, go back and take in some Bram. And maybe we just need to find a way to do a whole episode about J.R.R. Tolkien and psychedelics. Maybe there's some expert out.
Or just slip one in, just one reference every episode, just like a different quote, something, and just see who gets it.
I think we should need to start screening guests on this show. If they're not going to bring a Lord of the Rings reference into the room, you're out. I don't care how much you know.
I love it.
Well, so the other thing that you are talking about that speaks to me is the importance of preparation and, as I'm hearing it, integration. Are those parts of the program that you have? And would you ever recommend that someone dive into this without these components of their work being present?
Personally, I rarely use absolute statements. Always, never. I can fairly comfortably say I would never recommend that somebody jump into psychedelics without some kind of preparation, because psychedelics, in my experience and the experiences of people that I know and have worked with, like I said, they kind of drive the car. You can have the best intention. You can have the best, what we call set and setting. So the mindset that you're in and the physical setting that you're in. That's still going to take you where it wants you to go. You're not fully driving that car. And so if you are not prepared physically, safely, and having somebody in the room with you, if you're doing a large dose, to handle what comes up and to be able to lean into it, that's when we start finding bad trips, when people start resisting what's happening, because you're not necessarily going to be able to control where your brain goes. So I personally feel that preparation is absolutely critical. It is a huge part of the program that I do with people. So I'm going to be doing a group program, but it's one of the things that I do one-on-one with people as well. Is a decent chunk of what we're doing is preparation, and the other half is integration. The actual, plant medicine, I have such a hard time calling it a plant because it's a fungus. But the biologic, there we go. That's a small piece of what we're doing. Largely what we're doing is preparing you to be ready for whatever happens, even at a microdose level, and then helping you process that or utilize that neuroplastic window after you take a plant medicine to be able to make the changes that you're looking for. But preparation is absolutely critical.
Part of what we are deeply committed to here at Webdelics is making sure that the guests that come on this show and the information we provide give the whole truth. And so your assessment and candid discussion about risk with regards to this sort of treatment, particularly if there's not integration and preparation as part of the whole package, is particularly appreciated, Eliza. I would love to hear your favorite success story, because nothing inspires me more than hearing about someone who's been through the struggle and then overcome it. I want to look at the top of the mountain and see someone shining.
Oh my gosh. You know, it's interesting because and first of all, thank you, Scott. I really appreciate your commitment to harm reduction and the honesty and necessity of that and being able to bring that out, because I feel like with the excitement around psychedelics, that's not always one of the focal points. And
Yeah.
that's something that I really appreciate about the Webdelics podcast.
Thank
So
you.
thank you. Um, the interesting thing for me when it comes to success stories, particularly around microdosing, because that's what I specialize in, is it's not these huge, glorious aha moments that you do sometimes get off of a big trip. It's the consistent work that is done. And I think one of my favorites is somebody recently could feel gratitude. They were really sad. They were really struggling. They were having a really difficult moment. And normally they would have to talk themselves through, okay, I'm appreciative for these things, I'm grateful for these things, blah blah blah, but they couldn't feel it. And in this moment of temporary but very real despair that we all kind of ebb and flow through throughout the course of life, they thought of something else that they were grateful for, and they actually felt it in their body, and it changed what was happening, and it changed their state. And that was something that they couldn't access before. It was something that they always told themselves that they were grateful, but they couldn't feel it. And so it's that somatic, it's that brain body connection that seems incredibly small and that isn't always noticeable, but that builds over time with that type of work and that type of intention. And it's almost like you look back and see where you were and now where you are, and you didn't notice the change while it was happening, but you're a completely different person. It was really beautiful.
That is beautiful. And you're right. Sometimes big aha moments happen in life and they're wonderful and spectacular to observe. But realistically, how progress is made and how true transformation happens, at least in my experience, is through a zillion teeny tiny little baby steps. So that is the perfect segue into my final question for you, which is, how do you know that your burnout is either gone or that you've gotten better?
That is a great question. And largely, it's that for me, and for a lot of the people that I work with, it's finding that you respond differently or show up differently. And again, sometimes it takes you off guard, but being able to make decisions more easily, being able to hold boundaries better. That's a big one that we talk about. We haven't
I bet.
really talked about that here, but boundaries is a big part of burnout. Um, and showing yourself a little bit more grace, because we're all going to backslide. You know, we're all going to have moments, and being able to say, like, okay, I didn't do that, but I got my skills and I'm moving forward. And then some of the other markers that we see of recovery, of being able to exercise more, you know, not having that type of injury. So a lot of the things that we see with burnout symptoms, they start to get a little bit better. You're holding better boundaries so you're not as resentful. You're taking care of yourself. You're getting more sleep if you're able to, you know, doing whatever you need to be able to get to a point where those day-to-day stressors aren't breaking you the way they used to, because we are going to have stress. And I always try to remind people, stress is not the devil. We need stress. It does help our system. But staying in that constant state of stress is what we're struggling with. So being able to get yourself to a point where you can handle those day-to-day stressors with ease a little bit more, and respond in a way that feels more congruent with how you want to move through the world, is a really good indication.
I have such feeling for people who are living lives that every single day are filled with stress, despair, a sense of hopelessness, or being trapped in situations where they're constantly injuring themselves or getting sick or feeling fatigued. I think I feel that empathy because I've been there. And people that I care about have been there. When I hear you describe what it feels like on the other side, I have to say that for those of us that have experienced this or have people that we care about who have experienced this, it sounds like heaven.
It's pretty spectacular. I'm not going to lie. Having been on the other side of it for a while now, again, it's not that it doesn't show up, you know. And there are moments where it shows up and I'm like, shit. Like cuz I forget and I fall back into those patterns. But it's so much easier to forgive myself and it's so much easier to make the choices that I need to make sure that I'm okay.
This has been a rich, frankly, inspiring, and deeply informative conversation, Eliza. Thank you so much. One big thing that I have taken away from this is what we talked about earlier. Trauma, as someone I know once said, is the gift that just keeps giving. And it can show up unexpectedly as burnout, which if I ever start asking myself, Scott, are you burned out? I probably am. And understanding that then puts me in a position to assess all of the available tools, including things like microdosing, to be able to turn things around. If there is one final takeaway that you'd like to share, Eliza, what would that be?
For burnout in general and psychedelics specifically, please do not try to hack this on your own. If you're listening to this, these are not circumstances that are meant to be dealt with alone in a container, isolated. Part of the issue, I think, with burnout in general is that it is a very isolating experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to reach out for help if you don't know where to find it, this is a great place to start. Follow me on Instagram, DM me. If I'm not the right person for you, I will send you to somebody who is, because we want to make sure that we get people the right resources. And specifically with psychedelics, that is not something that, unless you are very well versed in them, you should undergo alone.
That's a message that Webdelics is happy to share. Now, you mentioned your Instagram account. I think you read my mind. More of this witchcraft power that you've got. How can people find you?
My website is www.theburnoutwitch.com. I am mostly active on Instagram with various kinds of humor and jackassery for the most part. My handles on LinkedIn, Instagram, and TikTok are The Burnout Witch.
Love it.
That's the best place to find me.
Love it. And life is too short not to laugh a lot. So thank you for bringing some levity and a sense of humor, even as I'm asking you these ridiculous questions, like whether you cackle or not. Now, for those of you who are listening or watching, if you enjoyed today's episode, oh man, do we have a lot to come. All you need to do is subscribe to our show on your favorite audio platform or on YouTube, and they'll start coming your way. Now, what do we have coming up? Well, we've got a discussion about psychedelics and aging coming up. We have a discussion about how psychedelics can enhance your yoga practice coming up. We have how to prepare for your very first psychedelic trip as a topic coming up. We also have an episode that I'm very excited about, which is on bad trips, something everyone asks about and we have to deal with. So keep tuning in. I'm stoked even thinking about these episodes, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot of value out of them too. Again, if you have enjoyed today's episode, let me repeat, please subscribe to our channels and then tell everyone that you know about what we're doing, because we want to get the word out. Also, don't forget to follow Webdelics on all of our social media channels: Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. We just want to see you pop up in our feed, and we want to know that you're there. And be sure to check out our website at webdelics.com. That's webdelics.com. Sign up to our blog for trusted and credible information about psychedelics and plant medicine. And then be sure to come back next time for another episode of the Webdelics Podcast.